Dear beautiful people, today I want to talk to you about what I call the small spiritual practice and the great spiritual practice. Well, the small spiritual practice often begins when we're done with suffering. Let's say you experience several crises in your life and there is a deep understanding that with the patterns of behavior that you had, you will not be able to continue without having to suffer severely. So then you are open to a small awakening. And when we're open to these small awakenings, there might be situations, for example, that we seek a psychotherapist, and the psychotherapist introduces us to mindfulness practice or maybe to meditation. Or you even find a spiritual teacher. Or maybe one of your friends introduces you to a modern, powerful spiritual book. Then you start practicing in order to go beyond suffering. But this practice is still in its essence selfish. And this is something that is difficult to hear when we still attach to the ego. Feels like an insult when someone says it. But the Buddhist practice goes, for example, a little bit deeper. You see, at first we might begin to rid ourselves of suffering. But with more and more practice, we might realize that when we go beyond it, when we stop suffering, that a wish comes to make this accessible for everyone else. A wish comes to liberate others from suffering, and this is the great practice. Now some of us, when we still practicing for selfish reasons, let's say we want to feel a little better, we want to handle psychological stress and so on, so our practice does not really go deep. Maybe we meditate for a while and your psyche improves and suddenly the motivation to practice drops until you start suffering again. Right? And this is the selfish type of practice. Now the deeper type of practice is the one to be where there is a deep desire within you to be of service to mankind. This attitude is much more powerful. This attitude leads to much greater depth because there is a willingness not only to go beyond suffering, but there is also a willingness to accept pain, accept discomfort, to find truth and share it. To become a vessel for truth. This is the path of the Bodhisattva. Well, what does a Bodhisattva do? A Bodhisattva is a soul collector. This is, let's say, a being that is reborn and chooses to bring others back to nirvana. Not in a literal sense that he grabs them by the hand and pulls them there, no, but he gives advice. He gives advice and helps them to find their unique way back to their original nature. So then, many bodhisattvas pick tremendous challenges in order to transform karma that is not only their own, but that is also collective. This is not an easy thing to do, and it can be tremendously challenging, it can be tremendously painful, but if your love is great enough, in that sense you're able to transform whatever obstacles are in front of you. And now here is a tremendous trap. If I speak of the small practice, which I said initially is a selfish practice, and if I speak of the great practice, now there's a huge chance that something egoic gets involved. Because there are many so-called helpers in the world who overwhelm themselves, who abuse themselves because they lack self-love, and therefore they sacrifice themselves on a daily basis, and they do not end the suffering because they cause tremendous suffering for themselves. Some of these helpers are psychotherapists, maybe EMTs, let's say emergency surgeons, people with difficult type of jobs who might press themselves to work harder and harder and harder because they lack self-love. They think they need to add something to themselves. This is not the practice that I speak of. The practice that I speak of is the one where we become so deeply loving that we are willing to share this love with the world. And with this intense love, we are able to go into the deepest challenges without being marked by them. Now, many of you want to get rid of pain. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly reasonable. And of course, if someone comes into my Zen school in order to learn how to go beyond pain, I will teach them. But without saying it, I will look for those where the greater practice is emerging. For those who are willing to go beyond the limited self. You see, many of us want to detach from thought because then the suffering ends. Mostly, like we stop being trapped in thoughts about past and future. We stop worrying, we stop regretting. We come back to the present moment. But once we are free of suffering, love arises, and then the deeper practice develops. Now, some don't want to go that path yet. And I understand that compassionately. Nobody can be pushed to go on the path of greater realization. So then, what people ask for is what they receive. If they ask for a tool to ease pain, to go beyond suffering, this is then what I'm willing to, let's say, teach as a service. But at the same time, I do understand that there is something much greater. And very few as of yet keep practicing, for example, when they're psychologically well. Very few of us, when we're doing fine, subjectively speaking, are still practicing hard, are still going deep, are still going into the deepest caves of the psyche, and are still doing the deepest shadow confrontations that we could potentially experience. So why would we do this to ourselves, to go into such a deep, dark level of practice? Well, because we cannot realize ourselves as a Buddha if we haven't embraced the shadows. As long as we have shadows within ourselves, we live in duality, we live in a subjective world of good and evil, but love does not want to be limited by those subjective perspectives. Love is the ultimate and it embraces all. So then in order to express that love, I gotta rid myself of dualities. And this practice is tremendously challenging. So we can only practice like that if our love is great enough. If we have already developed a deep sense of self-love, but now we even go beyond that, our love becomes from less specialized to more and more universal. So then we have, in that sense, realized the power to do the deep, mystical, occult practice that is very hard to do. And we are willing to let go of certain convenience and comforts in life. Because if we really solely focus on the practice, those conveniences and comforts, they distract us from our practice. So, to understand that the greater practice is the one where we seek to be of service, and the smaller practice is the one where we first of all consider our subjective suffering. Now be very clear not to get into an ego trap. Realize that none of that is wrong. It is not wrong to do the small practice. At some point the small practice will lead to the greater practice. But this is what I ask. This is what I ask to you, is the question, what level of practice do you want to reach? And often in Buddhist practice we speak about sameness, we speak about not comparing ourselves, we speak about that there are no differences. Ultimately this is true, but while you're here in time you experience still different levels of consciousness and of awareness. So not to identify with that, but at the same time to deny it would also be a form of rejection. Some of us are more evolved than others. That does not make anyone better or less worthy of love. But there is the possibility to develop a deeper practice. And to deny it because we seek sameness in order not to offend someone or to offend our own egos is not the way. So then, why am I speaking of this? Because I often do realize that when people start spiritual practice, once they think they got what they wanted, that they abandon it. And so they do not go beyond the small practice. Greater realization needs greater love. Contemplate about that. Be well.